Biden gives a speech from the gates of hell. More evidence that school closures were an utter debacle. We'll discuss all this more on this edition of The Editors. I'm Rich Lowry, and I'm joined as always by the Right Honorable Charles C.W. Cook, Phil Klein, and the notorious M.B.D. Michael Brendan Doherty. You are, of course, listening to a National Review podcast. Our sponsor of this episode is Acton Unwind. More about that in due course. If for some reason you're not already following us on a streaming service, you can find us everywhere from Spotify to iTunes. If you like what you hear here, please consider giving us a glowing 5-star review on iTunes. If you don't like what you hear here, please forget I said anything. So MBD, a speech about the soul of the nation and the threat to our very democracy last night. Let's go to the most obvious thing first. The advanced work on this speech was either really disturbing or incredibly incompetent, or some of both. They took Independence Hall, this iconic, beautiful building, and they lit it up, as far as I can tell, red and blue, for a red, white, and blue patriotic theme. But the center of the building was just red, and the TV shots were tight. So they're on Biden from the podium, and all you see is the red, and it's at night. It's also kind of dark. So you get this red and black fascist effect, very dystopian, like something out of a counterfactual movie where Hitler's won World War II.
Yeah.
Also a Dark Knight feel to it. What'd you make of it?
I mean, yeah, it brought up all sorts of associations. Like, there's like Star Wars film sequences, or Eyes Wide Shut sequences. It just seemed totally.
I didn't think of that, but I guess you're right.
Totally odd. Yeah, no, like you imagine like these robed figures coming out afterward to perform human sacrifices.
It's Philadelphia, so you never know.
It was, our friend Dan Foster joked, if Joe Biden was president, we never would have gotten that speech. And on one level, I agree, but on another level, this is a very Joe Biden speech. This is a Joe Biden speech in that, on the one hand, it framed itself as totally moderate, as we are committed to the Constitution. And there's some other people who aren't, or we are committed to civility, and we are against political violence and extremism, right? In other words, we're in the center, right? Mm-hmm. Forget the 1619 Project. Forget all the stuff about how America is fundamentally and erratically racist, and we have to get away from the constitutional inheritance. Forget 2020. Forget the George Floyd protests. So anyway, we're in the center. But it also has the they're going to put you all back in chains element of Biden's discourse.
Yeah, or very much the Georgia voting rights speech, which was just in daylight, with nice kids standing behind him. But
right.
This just had more of a MAGA focus and was just darker in all senses.
Yeah, and it was also it was interesting in that. And I think we'll get into this more. Clearly, Biden thinks making Trump the subject of our politics is good for Biden. And I think he's right.
Yeah, Phil, on the politics, we were talking about that a little bit before we started recording, and some of us are in different places. I see it very much in accord. I wrote this column Wednesday on how Biden and Trump have, in effect, a symbiotic relationship. Biden wants the midterms to be about Trump to the extent that that's possible. So the FBI search is great for Trump. His polls have gone way back up among Republicans. It's good for Biden because it makes the debate more about Trump. And I see this speech substantively in really important respects. It was totally indefensible. Obviously, what Trump is doing with his election denial is poisonous and should be denounced, but the way Biden made the case was hypocritical and over the top, and we can get more into that substance. But I don't think that really matters. I think they just want the debate to be about Trump to the extent the speech itself is controversial and in some respects actually indefensible is good because it creates more debate and more electricity around Trump. They want him to be as prominent in the midterms, and they want him to be the nominee in 2024. And nothing that they have done, broadly defined, whether it's stuff that Biden said, semi-fascist, or this speech, or things that his Justice Department is doing, all that is perfectly suited to both of those goals, increasing his prominence and getting him renominated.
Yeah, I basically think that it was a miscalculation politically, and I think that sort of kind of grand strategy is a bit a bit more than they're capable of. I think that if you look at it, the point of a speech like this is you want to figure out a way to win back a lot of the independents and maybe softer Republicans who don't like Trump but are somehow gettable because they don't like Trump or the direction of the party, but at the same time don't like Biden's policies. And you want to kind of fire up your base, depress the other base. I think this sort of failed on all of those levels because, okay, yeah, like people who are going to walk on glass to vote against any Republican probably like that speech. But that doesn't net you anything. However, you just gave another reason to the Republican base to get angry, and for even marginally attacked Republicans to just remind them of saying, okay, if I want a president, if to swallow the pill of Biden to get rid of Trump means I have to sign on to all of his radical agenda, because he tied his radical agenda to his pitch for a more civil, different politics. Of course, it's absurd to sort of say that like they're against lawlessness and they're defenders of the Constitution a week after he illegally gave hundreds of billions of dollars to political constituents before an election with just illegal student loan handout.
It's never like Trump is such a threat that we need to get beyond our ideological divisions. So I'm in favor of a 15-week abortion ban and building a wall at the border to gesture how serious I take this threat.
Yeah, but to me, it'll go down as one of the central failures of the Biden presidency, that basically the philosophy could have been, look, getting past Trump and his violation of norms and restoring faith in institutions is going to require us to, try to seek bipartisanship, to pursue a more modest agenda because we have to repair democracy. If that were really what the driving light was and everything else is secondary, then you wouldn't be trying to ram through reckless inflationary $2 trillion liberal wish list as COVID relief, and then trying to get through whatever you can on razor thin majorities, and then when the razor thin majorities won't support what you're going to do, then just do everything by executive fiat. That's not exactly how you convince the other people that elect us and we're going to put democracy first.
So Charlie, try to get in their heads. So when he trots out there and reads these lines about how we need the rule of law and we need the Constitution and that's the soul of the nation, are they just unaware? Do they put out of their heads what happened last week with the student loan jubilee? Or they just think anything they do is inherently righteous and good and must be legal? Or what are they thinking, if anything?
I don't know. I just know that as a viewer, it was absolutely farcical. There's this trend at the moment, I've noticed, that if you criticize President Biden for doing something completely illegal, antithetical to the rule of law, unconstitutional, people will say, but Trump. And I think those people ought to wonder why, when evaluating Joe Biden's behavior, the first thing that comes into their head is Trump. Doesn't that tell them something? Some of what Joe Biden said last night about Trump and what he calls MAGA Republicans is true. I wrote about it this week. Donald Trump's a lunatic. He's still trying to steal the 2020 election. He's unfit for office. He has preemptively announced that he doesn't believe in the constitutional order of the United States, and as such, he's disqualified. This does not let Joe Biden off the hook. If you run as the guy who is going to restore norms, if you run as the guy who is in favor of our constitutional order, if you run as the guy who will act as a bulwark in favor of the rule of law, you have to actually do it. You can point to the other guy when you're running. You can't once you've won. It was farcical watching Joe Biden try this last night. Just because Donald Trump is unfit for office does not mean that Joe Biden is fit. Last week, Joe Biden stole $1 trillion from the Treasury, gave it to people he wants to vote for him in a couple of months. It was an attack on Article 1. It was a willful, explicit undermining of our constitutional order. How dare he give that speech, especially in front of Independence Hall? That was the first problem with the speech.
Well, in his defense, Independence Hall was unrecognizable. So he has that going for him.
Well, that's true. The second problem with the speech, and this relates to your question, is that the Democratic Party has bit by bit, day by day, campaign by campaign, moved itself from the proposition that Donald Trump and his acolytes are unfit for office and are a threat and wish to reject the electoral process, which is true, into the proposition that the entire Democratic Party agenda is synonymous with democracy. We've seen this in the newspapers. Thomas Edsall suggested a couple of days ago that democracy will be on the ballot in Florida, and if DeSantis gets more votes than Charlie Crist, democracy will have lost. But you see this all the time. And what Joe Biden did last night was the culmination of that tendency. What he said was that not everyone in the Republican Party, not even a majority, is a MAGA Republican. Then he said MAGA Republicans are uniquely dangerous because they reject our electoral system. And then he said MAGA Republicans are pro-life. That doesn't make any sense. A majority of Republicans is pro-life. If being pro-life makes you a MAGA Republican, then a majority of Republicans must be MAGA Republicans, and must have been, for that matter, since about 1980. In fact, a lot of Democrats and independents must be MAGA Republicans too. They can't help themselves.
Yeah.
They've never been able to distinguish between the actual threat, the real threat, the threat that I've denounced over and over on this podcast, that I wrote about again yesterday, and what they want. They've never been willing to moderate, and they've never been willing to draw the lines that they say they believe in. And
yeah, and that Shelley, just sorry, on that hit against pro-lifers, and that he's drawing in like nuns who have rosary beads, outside abortion clinics and are praying, every single day and hoping to gently counsel, women in desperate straits. It's crazy.
It is crazy. It is also deeply destructive because it weakens what should be a sharp and necessary critique, and it turns off the people who will be necessary to alienate from the party those who reject the American constitutional order. And as a result, I think that speech was a catastrophe, not just for the country, but for what Joe Biden was hoping to achieve.
Can we say that too, that, listen, politics isn't beanbag, and there's no obligation to, to play nice in democracies, but you can't invoke these sacred values the way Joe Biden did last night and say that, make a speech saying we need to specifically, to preserve our whole system and way of life, exclude this group called MAGA Republicans, on which I'm heaping every social evil, after your party has spent tens of millions of dollars ensuring the nomination of MAGA Republicans, right? it makes the speech incredibly provocative.
But that's why I see the speech though within that framework. I think that those two it's not in contradiction to that effort to spend millions of dollars to nominate MAGA Republicans. It coincides with it.
Oh, of course, yeah. No, that's the
then we should hold the man in the utmost contempt, because if even that part of it was disingenuous, and it seems to be, because as Michael points out, not much time elapsed between last night's speech and this morning's New York Times piece on Chuck Schumer spending $3.5 million in New Hampshire trying to get what he calls ultra MAGA candidate nominated.
Think about it. When these guys are meeting in secret, are they saying, God, we hope Ron DeSantis or some other Republican without the baggage Donald Trump is the nominee in 2024? That'd be really good for the country. We hope that's true. They'd be harder to run against, but it would just be great if Trump disappeared.
I think your analysis might be right, but as I say, then that calls upon us to hold Biden in the utmost contempt, because he stood there as the president of the United States in front of a sacred American building, flanked by Marines, and made a speech in which he said he was defending the integrity of the constitutional order. And if you're telling me this is all an electoral ruse, then there's nothing about that speech at all that one could hold on to.
Well, I think they he sincerely believes all that, and their agenda is
no. We can't have. Sorry, Rich. We can't have it both ways.
Yeah, no. Let me explain why I think
you cannot help people get elected that you think are a threat.
Yeah, well, I think they sincerely think like everything they do is righteous and pro-democracy, all the rest of it. At the same time, so when he says all that stuff about pro-lifers, includes them and all that, I mean, he sincerely believes that. But they know, I think, the cynical part of it is they know they're stirring the pot in a way that helps the MAGA Republicans, so-called, and helps Trump.
Then they don't believe it. I mean, I'll say it again. If my great fear were that someone was going to come into my house and try and kill my family, I wouldn't invite them in. And if I did invite them in, then it wouldn't be my great fear.
Right.
You just cannot have this both ways.
And by the way, this is like just as on the level of God's utter failure to teach humanity anything with events. This is what they wanted in 2016, and it was an absolute disaster for them. They wanted Trump then, and it blew up in their face. They want him again, and I agree that Trump is much weaker now. He could be just strong enough politically to win the Republican nomination and lose again in a big election, energized election for Democrats. That could be true. But why do you want to attempt fate again the same way? Like, it's just like, I mean, it's literally like, can God not teach us anything? Like, we're going to put the golden calf in the high places again and just wait for lightning to strike us. Like, this is astonishing to watch play out in real time. So I don't get it.
So, Phil, meantime, we've had these, Charlie alluded to them, these really just crackpot posts from Trump on Truth Social this week. There was a story, I guess it was about a year ago. Maggie Haberman of the New York Times wrote about how Trump was telling people that he should be restored to office. And there's kind of silence from Trump world, and then denials from people around Trump. Oh, he's not saying that. And then here we have it, black and white in his own words. And then he's also saying now that if he's elected, he's going to pardon a lot of the January 6th rioters and give them an official government apology. I don't know. How long did it take? We apologized, right, to the Japanese Americans we interned in World War II eventually, right? After like 5 decades. But 2 years later, we're going to apologize to people who ransacked the U.S. Capitol.
Well, to be fair to Trump, he's now climbed down a little. He says that if they aren't going to reinstate him immediately, they should at least have a new election to elect.
That's the modest option.
So he's willing to throw them a bone and say, like, as long as we have another presidential election now, that that could be okay. Charlie pointed this out, which I think it's important. And it's difficult to be a reasonable person in this era of politics. But I mean, Trump's off the rails. Like every day, provides a reminder of why Democrats are a major threat to this country, to its Constitution, why their policies are awful and destructive to the country. And then a reminder of how the person that a large percentage of Republicans are supportive of, and nearly every Republican is indulgent of, or at a minimum afraid to criticize, just on a daily basis, says completely off the wall and destructive things. I mean, we saw on January 6th how Trump's rhetoric, irresponsible rhetoric, could really like whip people up into a frenzy. And having seen that, he's basically saying, if he gets reelected, these people are pardoned. So it just a sort of, those people were there on January 6th because they believed, thanks to Trump, that their country was being stolen from them, that there was an actual coup going on in installing an illegitimate president. And Trump spent months convincing them that that was the case. And now he's sort of saying basically that if they riot again and cause more violence and destruction, essentially they'll be forgiven. And a lot of the defenses of people in court have been, of the January 6th people, have been saying, look, Trump said, the president of the United States was saying, like, we should go down there and disrupt things in the Capitol and we should march on the Capitol. That's the sort of one of the defenses of a January 6th defendant. And here Trump is sort of stirring things up, and it just shows how reckless and irresponsible it is. It's all just fun and games to him, and it actually has destructive consequences. And it's just absolutely depressing that these are the polls that we're debating on, and not the arguments about should government be bigger or smaller or be involved in this or that.
Yeah, it's not even close. These are the craziest things any former president of the United States has ever thought or said. These are the craziest things any just major political figure in America has thought or said. I mean, it's just completely off the charts. We have to move on. Exit question to you, Charlie, first. Biden's hellscape Philadelphia speech will be remembered for about 2 weeks, will be remembered through this November in the midterm elections, will be remembered through November 2024, or will be remembered forever?
I think it'll be remembered forever just because of the images.
Yeah.
MBD.
Yeah, of course. I mean, those things are going to live on as memes, right? Like, until Biden is done as a political figure, and then they'll live on afterward, too.
Phil.
Yeah, I think this is sort of one of those infamous presidential speeches, Bush mission accomplished, Carter Malay's speech.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is just one of those iconic and infamous presidential speeches.
I think these days everything fades eventually. So I'm going to say through November 2022. With that, let's hear from our sponsor this episode, Acton Unwind and Inflation. Spiking gas prices and supply chain disruptions, woke celebs and corporations, political cronies and big tech, polarization, and a culture in crisis. We know it's hard to stay up to speed with everything that's happening in the world. That's where Acton Unwind comes in. Join experts from the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty every Monday as they dissect the latest headlines in an easy-to-unravel roundtable conversation. Chat about politics, religion, and culture through Acton Institute's unique perspective, connecting good intentions with sound economics to promote a free and virtuous society characterized by individual liberty and sustained by religious principles. To subscribe to Acton Unwind, visit acton.org/NR or just search Acton Unwind on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. That's acton.org/NR to subscribe. Acton.org/NR. Please check it out. So, Phil Klein, we have this is not surprise, but it's underlined it and put an exclamation point on it. Just a debacle, just a total human debacle that school closures were during the pandemic. Worst learning loss in 30 years, just a nightmare, in particular with regard to math, but learning loss across the board. And of course, this is also not surprising, particularly hard hit were those students who are already struggling.
Yeah, it's just unbelievable. And I mean, the story out today is that or this week is that math and reading scores of 9-year-olds erased 2 decades of progress because they dropped so severely. And this was completely not only predictable, but it was predicted. And this was why so many of us were savagely fighting for schools to reopen. I remember writing about this in April of 2020, that it was urgent to get schools reopened. It was obvious that remote learning was a complete catastrophe to anyone that had children within days of this starting. And it's also obvious, it was obvious based on information we have from summer breaks, how learning loss disproportionately affects people from lower incomes or difficult backgrounds. Because let's face it, like, people who are wealthy, well-off, highly educated, 2-parent households, who are very involved in their children's educations, are not going to let time go by without reinforcing and being on top of everything. And in households that don't have that, you have a single mom, a single working parent who don't have resources or just don't have as much interest, who rely on schools to provide breakfast and lunch for their kids. Those households, they slip behind in the summer, and this was like a year-long summer vacation. It was absolutely just devastating. And it's infuriating because we were arguing from the get-go that this is a complete disaster. If you looked even at the guidance that had existed in school closures at the time of the start of the pandemic, I wrote about this at the time. They basically said, well, a few weeks of school closures, you're not going to have that much of an effect on a virus transmission, but it's not going to make that big of a deal in terms of long-term learning. Once you get into like 6 to 8 weeks, it might help more on the viral element, but it's questionable in terms of whether it starts to cause problems. And then after the chart didn't even really go beyond like a year. Nobody contemplated this because it was so clear that they were like, at a certain stage, like, it doesn't do much for the virus. People are with their grandparents, other caregivers. They have to like see other people outside of school, and the benefits are questionable, and the effects are devastating. So it's just unimaginable. And this lies with the teachers' unions and all of the politicians that were in the pockets of the teachers' unions. And it's an absolute disgrace. And these people should just be driven out of polite company. Randy Weingarten should be seen as the villain as she is, and all of her ilk. It's an absolute abomination, and it's will go down as, I think, the most destructive example of public policy failure of the century, I think, because it was just such an absolute debacle, and for decades we'll be paying the price for this.
Well, Charlie, I don't know. We had Karine Jean-Pierre saying yesterday that it was Democrats who came in and reopened the schools in spite of Republicans.
They try this from time to time. Do you remember when it was actually Republicans who wanted to defund the police? because I don't know, they voted against some federal
Oh,
bill that
vaguely.
included
Yeah,
a
right.
line in it that maybe had the word police in it or referred to sting or something. I don't know. So they're trying this here. It's laughable. It's sinister as well. No one in the room pushed back. It's our brave firefighting press corps for you. But of course it won't work. I was trying to imagine how that would go across if Charlie Crist tried it in Florida. People would laugh him out of the room. I think we all know who was on what side in this dispute. This is one of the defining political divides of the last 2 years. It does speak to something in progressivism that in turn speaks ill of progressivism, and that is the need at all points in history to be correct. You occasionally read these illiterate articles saying conservatives were conservative, therefore every single piece of change that has ever happened in American history was opposed by them, and all of the changes that have happened were the product of progressives because, progressive progress, and therefore we're right and they're wrong. And this retconning is of a piece with that. The one last week I saw was on nuclear energy. PBS, was it PBS, NPR, one of them, had a piece saying that increasingly people are coming to the conclusion that we're going to need nuclear energy because of the work of environmentalists who have decided this. Really? I think the environmentalists were wrong about nuclear energy for 50 years, and I'm glad that they're changing their minds, if indeed they're changing their minds. But it was not environmentalists who have been pushing for nuclear energy. It was, if anything, environmentalists who have eventually come round to the acknowledgement that we're going to need nuclear energy. And the same is true of school closures. I am pleased that at long last, that the Democratic Party and the vast majority of center-left people in this country have recognized that what happened was a disaster and that Florida under DeSantis got it right. But they did not push for this. They were, in fact, the people who needed to be pushed against, dragged kicking and screaming into this position. And the idea that we would now be told that they were for this all along, and it was the Republicans who were intransigent and therefore share the blame for the ill consequences, is grotesque. But I think it's inevitable in the progressive psyche. I think they can't be wrong. They're much more willing to go back in time and rewrite history than
But keep in mind
conservatives are.
that it wasn't just that they stopped schools from reopening when the DeSantises and Kemps and all the other Republican states reopened schools. We'd get columns and statements about this is an experiment in human sacrifice.
Monsters,
Teachers will die, children will die. And the media was part of fueling this too, because you'd basically have these stories at the start of the school year, teacher dies of COVID. And then you have to get to paragraph 8 to learn they caught it somewhere before school started, and then they died around the time that school started. But the headline makes it sound as though teachers are dying, and that's what gets tweeted out and promoted by the union. So the media were complicit in this as well.
So MBD, on that theme, Jason Furman, who's I think increasingly a central follow on Twitter, the former Obama economist, he tweeted when this study came out of this 3 decades learning loss that everyone should remember that this woman, I don't particularly know her work, but she's Professor at Brown University, Emily Oster, who works on education. She was warning this was going to happen. And she's obviously kind of a center-left person, and apparently was just completely excoriated by the left for making what I'm sure were evidence-based arguments about why this was going to be a debacle. And Furman's point was she's been fine, she wasn't canceled, but the problem is there are other people who agreed with her who wouldn't say it out of fear. And his ultimate warning is don't pre-censor yourself, but that's the culture we live in. Yeah,
I mean the discipline on the left was ferocious during COVID. Not just on school closures, but on masks, on the vaccines. It was unbelievable, right? Like, I mean, it was such, of course, like at the highest levels, the government was telling Facebook and other people what posts they should begin censoring, or suggesting what posts they might begin censoring. So yeah, I mean, using shame and humiliation and pile-ons against Emily Oster was not a surprise. I mean, it's interesting. How did this come about? We keep saying that the worst affected, of course, are more marginal students, or disproportionately Black and Hispanic students. I will say this, though. One thing we shouldn't forget is that when parents were polled, it was disproportionately Black and Hispanic, or Black parents who didn't want school to return too early. So just one mitigating factor there. That turned out to be the wrong call, though. And it was a wrong call that was uniquely American, and that America has to answer for. Europe didn't close schools for this long. Nowhere in Europe closed schools for as long as Americans did. No one in Europe operated schools with remote learning for as long as we did, or with masks for as long as we did on children as young as we did. No one did that. And the only places that did do anything like it, like Singapore, I mean, you have the president of Singapore saying, like, you have to get rid of the masks on children in Singapore. It's hurting their language and social development.
And also, I think this speaks to a few other things, which is, one, just the problem with the deranged, hatred of Trump rotting people's minds. Because when Trump called for schools reopening, support for schools reopening turned into a complete partisan issue, and the support for reopening schools dropped like a rock. Also, in terms of the corruption of institutions, you had the American Academy of Pediatrics that had, for a brief moment, called for reopening schools in the fall of 2020, and then they got furious pushback from the teachers' unions, and who were trying to associate them as doing Trump's bidding, and then they had to update their recommendations to distance themselves from it. And the CDC, Biden CDC, similar thing happened. They had recommendations on reopening, and then the emails reveal that they had to check with Randy Weingarten to issuing guidance on schools, and they were completely in the pocket of.
Wow, Phil, it's almost like you've been keeping book on this.
So, can I shout out one person, a couple of people that deserve credit? Yep. There's a liberal journalist, Alec McGillis, who very, very early, and I know this because I know he does work with students in Baltimore, saw that this was going to be an absolute disaster, and he did absolutely great, moving journalism on what this was costing children. He did a great piece in ProPublica comparing a town in New Mexico that was shut down with a town in Texas just across the border that was open. And it was guys like that I think began slowly chipping away at this giant iceberg of progressive opinion. And I'm very grateful to figures like him.
So, Charlie Cook, X question to you again. First, the next time, not necessarily next pandemic, but the next big crisis that we don't quite know how to handle, we'll look back at the pandemic, and because of that experience, avoid groupthink and avoid over deference to experts or so-called experts. Yes or no?
Well, probably not, because these pandemics seem to come around every 100 years, and by that point we'll have forgotten all the lessons we learned and have to learn them all over again.
MBD, and again, not necessarily a pandemic, but the next big crisis, we'll have learned our lessons here. Yes or no?
No, because basically there's a party that's pro-expert and there's a party that's anti-expert now, and we're in trouble because of that.
Phil Klein.
No, I don't think that we'd learn the lesson. I mean, maybe we won't make the same exact precise mistakes. I don't think we'll close schools for 2 years over a pandemic, but will make other severe mistakes thanks to expert consensus that turns out to be wrong.
Yeah, I think the answer pretty clearly is no. We have learned nothing in part because of what MBD gets at, that there are just two sides on this, and one will never ever learn the lesson from the pandemic. And in fact, thinks we didn't have enough groupthink and didn't show enough deference to Anthony Fauci and the rest of them. With that, brief plug for the National Review Institute Buckley dinner coming up out in California at the Reagan Library, honoring the great Larry Kudlow, our friend, former National Review staffer way back in the 1990s, former Reagan economist, former CNBC host, former Trump economist, current Fox business host, one of the best communicators in the business way back in the day when I would occasionally do the McLaughlin group. John McLaughlin's show was just an incubator for TV talent. I remember him telling me once Larry Kudlow was among the best he had ever seen, which is absolutely true, and a wonderful guy. These events are terrific. They're elegant. They're fun. They're memorable. It's opportunities to rub shoulders with a lot of friends and like-minded people. So we really urge you to be part of it. If you can, check it out at nrinstitute.org, nrinstitute.org for more information about the dinner, which I believe is September 29th. Yeah, I'm looking at my notes here, September 29th. It's going to be in that really famous room with Air Force One hanging from the ceiling. So it'll be a terrific setting and a wonderful evening. With that, Charlie, there's been some yeasty discussion on NRO about Blake Masters and more broadly how we should think about the Republican Party at the moment. This was occasioned by Blake Masters maladroitly scrubbing his website. The way I think about this with regard to abortion, the way I think about this is Blake Masters had a pre-Dobbs website geared to a Republican primary audience. Then we get Dobbs. He wins the primary, and then he needs to hopefully win a general election with positions that just aren't defensible. As I think the particular problem there was an endorsement of federal personhood bill, whereas it's become clear that if unless you're in the deepest red parts of the country, you need to be an incrementalist on abortion. And lo and behold, he scrubbed his website and became an incrementalist on abortion. Our friend and colleague Kevin Williams is like, don't vote for this fraud. Zan DeSantis said a similar thing, I believe, on Twitter to show my cards. I just think this is what Republicans have to do. Might have other concerns about Blake Masters, but this would not cause me to withhold my vote from him.
Nor would it cause me to withhold my vote from him. As I said to Kevin, even if one were to take at face value Kevin's judgment as to the desirability or suitability of the Republican Party, what we're talking about here is affecting divided government in a midterm. We're not talking about re-electing Trump. We're not talking about endorsing Trump or Trumpism. We're talking about putting an end to a unified democratic government that has done all sorts of things that I oppose and Kevin opposes, that has proved itself to be lawless, and that has made it clear that if it has more members to work with, it will change the system, potentially pack the Supreme Court, certainly abolish the filibuster, maybe even acknowledge and admit new states. I want to stop that. And my distaste for the Blake Masters of the world is secondary, especially given that the sins of the Republican Party are not the only ink on the ledger. Mazi Hirono is a US senator. It seems unreasonable to me that only one side should have to keep itself pure. More broadly, though, I think that we have to avoid taking the wrong lessons from Trump and denouncing people all the time. I've noticed a confusion in certain progressive circles that people who are willing to say Trump is unfit for office or has disqualified himself are not willing to extend the same to a Ron DeSantis or a Blake Masters. And that's because most people within our political system are not Donald Trump. The correct approach, in my estimation, when evaluating a politician is to first ask whether they have done anything that is disqualifying. And if not, to ask whether or not they are broadly in agreement with you, and then to ask whether they are more in agreement with you than the opponent. So let's take Herschel Walker. Now, I don't think Herschel Walker is a good candidate. He's not my idea of a US senator. But I also don't think he's disqualified himself from office. He hasn't said, for example, that he should be reinstated without an election. He hasn't made it clear ahead of time he's going to violate the law. He hasn't done anything that would render him categorically unfit for office. So then what is the question? Well, the question is, do I broadly agree with Herschel Walker's policy positions? And the answer there is yes. Do I prefer Herschel Walker to his opponent? Yes, I do. Would I therefore vote for him if I lived in Georgia? Yes, I would. And I think the same about Blake Masters. Now, on the specific question of abortion, I'm bothered by his behavior too, although I'm not surprised. This is how politicians behave on both sides of the aisle. But I am less bothered by his behavior than I am by the stated policy positions on abortion of his opponent, Mark Kelly.
Right.
And if my aim here is to save the lives of unborn children, which it is, then I would vote for Blake Masters in furtherance of that aim. Now, again, if Blake Masters had said, when I get into office, I'm going to try and execute people, of course I'm not going to vote for him. If Blake Masters had said, when I'm a senator, I'm going to try and violate the rules of the Senate, then of course I'm not going to vote for him. But he hasn't. What he's done is show that he's spineless.
So, Charlie, let me congratulate you on an excellent, compelling answer that happens to agree totally with what I think about this. But let me push you before we get others in. So, how about Mastorino in Pennsylvania, who Masters? I'm not sure Masters believes any of the stolen election stuff. I doubt he does. But Mastorino is a true believer. He was there on January 6th. I mean, he's basically made suggestions that he would try to monkey with the outcome if it goes the wrong way for Trump if he's the nominee in 2024 and Mastorino's the governor. Where does he fall on your line?
Well, I think he must be fine because he was endorsed during the primary by the Democratic candidate for governor. So all of the things that the Democrats are saying about him, I must assume aren't true. No, look, I wouldn't vote for him because he has made it clear ahead of time that he would play with the system. Donald Trump tried to rewrite the 12th Amendment to make the vice president an election dictator. That's disqualifying in my book. And Mastorino is on board with that. That's his view as well. So no, I wouldn't vote for him.
So Phil, I believe you have a darker view of Blake Masters.
Yeah, I mean, just putting aside the whole issue of would you or not vote for him, I have a column out today that basically says, look, it's totally understandable to say, and it's a view many of us have expressed, that essentially in a post-Roe world, you want to support the most aggressive restrictions that you are politically feasible in a given state. And that's going to mean that in some states like Arizona, supporting more moderate positions on abortion than what you could pass in Georgia or Alabama or Mississippi. That's totally understandable. And you could say, okay, he's trying to sell himself to a broader general election audience. This is normal politics. So that's fine as far as it goes. But the issue that I have is that right now there's a big split among conservatives, and it's not just on ideology. A big part of it is this idea that there are some of us that believe in institutions, in Constitution, in trying to work within the system to advance our ideological aims. And there are other people that say, the conservatives that could be defined as the new right or national conservatives, MAGA. I call them Fight Club conservatives. But a big animating view is that no, all of those things like talking about the Constitution and stuff and free market fundamentalism, that's handcuffing us. We need to smash the woke corporations, use the state to punish our enemies. And we can't, none of this mealy mouth establishment, conservative ink talk on culture war. Blake Masters was a champion of that that movement. He's supposed to be an exemplar of the sort of fighting Republican. He talked during his campaign about we have to understand the stakes in the culture war. We have to wake up. Republicans have to wake up. So you can't have it both ways. You can't basically go around calling every conservative that has reservations about the idea of using the state as a weapon to punish enemies and reward friends, that any conservative who raises questions about that is somehow a complete wuss. And yet you come out on the most important cultural issue, and then you start saying, well, I'm just going to be a pragmatist on this. When it comes to human life, I'm going to suddenly be a pragmatist and not a truth-telling culture warrior.
So, MED, a question to you, because we got a hard out. We got to meet here in about 8 minutes. Rate your current feelings towards the Republican Party on the classic 0 to 10 scale. 0, you're not voting for any of these bastards. They've all disgraced themselves in one way or the other, if by nothing else, just their association with the GOP. Or 10, everything is fine and going along swimmingly.
I mean, this is the first election where I'm tempted to vote Republican up and down the ballot. I mean, in my life. Yeah, I mean, oh God, I'm going to get fired for saying, but I mean, I'm not, listen, I get a huge political voice over at National Review, and a lot of times Republicans support something I find unsupportable. Blake Masters is not one of them. I would definitely vote for him. He's to the right of basically every Republican I've ever had a chance to vote for in New Jersey or New York on issues I care about. So I don't know. I feel better about the Republican Party on its positions now than I have in a long time. So yeah, as positive as ever.
Charlie Cook, 0 to 10.
Sorry, I think I missed the question.
So rate your feelings towards the Republican Party in general at the moment. 0, you're not voting for any of these people. They've all disgraced themselves. Or a 10, everything's fine, going swimmingly, just like we planned and hoped.
Well, overall, it's about a 5. In Florida, it's about an 8. And I would say that irrespective of my view of the Republican Party, I want divided government, and therefore am hoping that we get it.
Phil Klein.
I would say it too. I'm not going to say,
Wow.
I wish every Democrat gets elected. But I think that we have to, while being very open-eyed about the destruction that liberalism and the Democrats are wreaking on this country, and that we certainly don't want them to have unified government. I think we have to be open-eyed about the direction of the Republican Party, and the fact that any Republican majority is going to contain a lot of people who are denying the election and saying all sorts of completely crazy stuff. So it's kind of depressing that at this moment we don't have a more plausible, credible opposition, and that so many of these people would rather focus on, 2020 denialism and Trump's ego trip than actually just focus on saving us from this disaster of a presidency.
So I would say a 6. I mean, just in the context of this midterm, I think basically all of them have to win. All of them are better than the alternative. It's necessary to slam the brakes on what's going on. But I was fairly hopeful about the prospects of the party in the immediate aftermath of 2020. I've at times been hopeful, more hopeful than not. Glenn Youngkin, Brian Kemp. But the overall trend has been really, really bad. And you could point to Trump's grip kind of slowly loosening. You saw some signs of that, a month or two ago in the polling around the country. DeSantis tied with Trump in New Hampshire, ahead of him in Florida, et cetera, et cetera. And that's all been blown away by the FBI search. Maybe it comes back, but I don't know. It is a concerning, to say the least, picture. With that, real quick, NR Plus plug. Real quick, sign up for NR Plus. People, do yourself a favor. Digital subscription service at nationalreview.com. It's going to make your life easier and better in all sorts of ways as a reader, and support our valuable journalism. NR Plus. NR Plus. With that, let's hit a few other things before we go. MBD, you finally saw Top Gun Maverick.
Yeah, finally. I threatened to watch it on the iPad for the first time. But it's a great action movie, and the more action in it, the better. I thought all the sequences in actual Navy planes were amazing, and really exciting. And the plot and the cheesy screenwriting down on the ground was pretty poor, but luckily they stayed in the air most of the film.
You only need to see it 2 more times to catch up to Sarah, who has seen it 3 times, right, Sarah?
That's correct.
Awesome. So, Phil Klein, speaking of watching stuff, you've watched RRR?
Yeah, it's kind of a totally bizarre Indian blockbuster. It's actually the most expensive movie ever shot in India. And it's hard to even describe. I've been joking that it's sort of Rambo meets Gandhi meets The Matrix meets the Death Wish. It's just this sort of sprawling 3-hour epic, very anti-colonial British, so maybe more of an MBD than a Charlie film. But it's just sort of totally outrageous, over the top, and just surprisingly entertaining.
And Charlie, you've been transferring vinyls to digital.
I have.
What you would expect.
Well, I want to be able to listen to them without having to put them on a turntable and sit in my house, especially in my car or outside. And I've just forgotten how good records that were made during the vinyl era sound on vinyl. There's often no point transferring modern records to vinyl, but if they were supposed to be on vinyl, if they were recorded in studios that were set up to produce records that would be mastered for vinyl, they really do sound different. So I've been having a great time sitting and writing and listening to those. It's
kind of amazing if you think about it. Like, if you knew nothing about recording in modern life, and just someone put this disc, gave you 10 discs that look totally indistinguishable, these round things, and then they all produce this incredibly different and diverse sound. It's so rich and deep. It's really extraordinary.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm glad the college football season is going in earnest. I'm a big baseball fan, but basically I'll just randomly watch Yankee games. I will not sit and watch some other random baseball game. I will, on ESPN or whatever, I'll pause and watch some baseball highlights. But college football, yeah, just in any game, I'll pause and watch. And last night it was the Backyard Bowl, which had been suspended for 11 years. I don't know, maybe a conference thing. I don't know what. But between West Virginia and Pittsburgh, huge rivalry game, and just tremendously compelling. I didn't watch much of it. I just saw the very end where Pittsburgh was up by a touchdown. West Virginia was driving, had a 4th and 16, I don't know, from the 25, from Pitt's 25 or something, and got a pass right at the goal line that was initially ruled a catch, but it hit the ground and the receiver didn't have control, and there was a review, and the stand, people are going crazy in the stand. It's just what a fantastic sport. So with that, it's time for our editor's picks. MBD, what's your pick?
My pick is a piece that's on the website today by Russ Latino about the Jackson water shortage. I don't know if listeners have heard of this, but Jackson, Mississippi is having a huge crisis in its water system. I didn't understand how this crisis came about until I read this piece and how it might be resolved. It's just a great piece of journalism.
Phil Klein, what's your pick?
It's actually also on the site today, Biden's looming giveaway to Iran. It's our editorial. And I just think that with everything else going on, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that Biden's about to give upwards of $1 trillion in sanction relief in a desperate attempt to strike a new deal with Iran. And it's actually worse than the Obama-Iran deal. And it's another thing that he's going to try to implement without Congress, despite the constitutional requirement of 2/3 majorities for treaty approval. So this will be another executive agreement, and it's actually catastrophic. And so we should keep it on our radar while we sort of also are outraged about other stuff.
Charlie Cook, it's your pick.
My pick is Phil's piece, Blake Masters and the Limits of Fight Club Conservatism. I think that it does, as Phil suggests, demonstrate that if you live in a country with other people and if you want to win a majority of votes, then you often have to make concessions, not concessions that you would make if you were sitting on your own, writing what you believe, but concessions that you make if you want to hold public office. And I agree with Phil. A lot of the people who send me emails saying, I can't believe you say this or that, or you think this, wow, ought to look at their response to Blake Masters and acknowledge that when it comes to it, they actually understand too that politics is not a game always of purity.
So my pick is a piece by Nate Hawkman on Major League Baseball and what's happened with its Pride Nights or Pride Days or whatever they are. But basically, MLB teams are funneling funds to groups that support the most hideous sort of quote unquote transitions for gender confused youth. And just if there had been a meeting like 5 years ago of activists saying, we're going to get Major League Baseball teams like the Detroit Tigers to support the most radical version of our agenda, you would have thought they were crazy, completely lunatic. But it's happened. And this piece, you can tell when someone's done the work and has the receipts, and it's a very impressive piece of work. So that's it for us. You've been listening to a National Review podcast, and your rebroadcast, retransmission, or account of this game without the express written permission of National Review Magazine is strictly prohibited. This podcast has been produced by the incomparable Sarah Schutte, who makes us sound better than we deserve. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, MBD. Thanks to Act and Unwind, and thanks especially to all of you for listening. We're the editors. We'll see you next time.